Macro lenses are expensive, and as a wedding photographer, it's a waste of time for me to buy a specialty lens just for 1 or 2 shots that I'm going to deliver to my clients. So in this video, I'm going to share with you 10 tips for photographing wedding rings without a dedicated macro lens. What's up everyone, Reggie B Photo here and welcome back to the channel. So for those of you who are new, my name is Reggie Ballesteros and I'm a wedding photographer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Before I was a professional wedding photographer, my main interest in photography was actually toy photography. As an introvert, I avoided photographing people as much as possible and I was obsessed with telling the stories behind these inanimate Lego minifigures through the use of lighting and visual context. Fast forward 8 years, as a wedding photographer, I'm mainly photographing people, and as an introvert, I have to immerse myself in social environments to document their lives, direct my clients to post their portraits, and I'm forced to produce consistent work in really less than ideal photographic conditions when the stress and the pressure of a wedding day really calls for it. At the end of the wedding day, photographing the wedding rings is my way to reconnect to my roots as a toy photographer. I can build my own little world out of the textures and objects found in the field. I can create a dramatic mood using portable LED lights, and I can do it all really without having to own a specialty macro lens. With that, here are 10 tips to help you photograph wedding rings. Tip number 1 is to use a mirrorless camera. Everything in this video will be demonstrated on my main wedding photography cameras, the Fujifilm X-T3, but you can pretty much apply these settings, techniques, and approach to any camera brand. With that said, it is actually helpful to have a mirrorless camera that allows you to preview the lighting as you build up the photo, as well as zoom in to check focus in real time. This saves you from having to take dozens of test shots. Tip number 2 is to use a macro extension tube. Physically, a macro extension tube attaches between the camera and the lens, extending the lens further out from the camera sensor, and optically, this shifts the focus zone of the attached lens, allowing you to focus on smaller objects, in this case, wedding rings. I use the Fujifilm MCEX-16, which is a 16mm extension tube. Fujifilm also makes an 11mm extension tube, and for those who are looking for a cheaper option, I definitely recommend checking out the extension tube set from JJC, which also includes both the 11 and the 16mm extension tubes for really less than the cost of just one Fujifilm branded extension tube. As far as I know, the image quality and the operation from the JJC extension tube should be exactly the same, but I've actually never tried them myself. And just a word of warning, with an extension tube attached, you do lose the ability to focus at further distances, i.e. normal to infinity distances. So be sure to remove the extension tube before you resume the normal shooting of the wedding, and please be sure to plan ahead and photograph the rings during a break in the wedding when you don't have to be rushed or unconsciously asked to photograph something else. Personally, I like to photograph the rings during the open dancing section of the wedding. Tip number 3 is to repurpose your portrait lens for photographing wedding rings. So using an extension tube allows me to take macro shots without having to buy a separate and usually expensive macro lens. I've shot with the 80mm f2.8, and while it is super sharp, I just don't shoot with true macro shots enough to justify having it in my kit. From my experience, I found that portrait lenses work perfectly with the extension tubes for the magnification and working distance needed for close-ups of the wedding ring. So I tried both the 56mm 1.2 and the 50mm f1.0 with really great results. When you're selecting lenses to pair with an extension tube or macro photography in general, you always want to consider the magnification and the working distance. So magnification is how big the subject will be reproduced in the frame. On Fujifilm X mount, the magnification of about 0.4 is what I target for ring shots. Anything larger than that ends up taking like too much of the frame. Anything smaller than that ends up looking just like a normal non-macro shot to me. And working distance is how far the front of the lens is from the point of focus at maximum magnification. So this is important as you want to ensure that you have enough room to place any lighting that you may need. Wide angle lenses have pretty amazing magnification with macro extension tubes, but that is at the expense of being super close to the subject. This is why I've landed on like the 50mm to 56-ish millimeter focal range for that sweet spot. If you are curious to see what kind of effect you may get with different types of Fujifilm lenses, Fujifilm actually makes a handy chart with the magnification and working distances tabulated for all their lenses, and I've included a link of that down in the description below. Tip number 4 is to use continuous lighting. My approach to ring shots involves kind of building up the photo one light at a time. So each highlight, each shadow on the rings is intentionally placed. While I use flashes and speed lights for wedding reception documentation, those situations when I need a lot of power, lighting wedding rings with flashes would actually be a really clumsy process needing a lot of test shots. Instead, I found that using continuous lighting, specifically LEDs to light up my ring shots, changes everything. I've used a variety of different brands and models, but for this year I've landed on an LED lighting kit from Nanlite. So Nanlite did not directly sponsor this video, or they didn't pay me to say anything specific about their products, but they did send me a couple lights over so that I can teach you all how to create wedding ring photos. The LED models that I've been using in 2021 are the PavoTube 2.6C and the Lido Light 5C. So the PavoTube is a 10-inch LED tube that has a diffused surface. So I use this light mainly as a rim light or accent light for the rings, and also to kind of light up or add highlights to any textures or objects that I include in the background. The Lido light is a mini LED panel that has a bare bulb LED panel, but it also includes a rubber diffuser. So I use this light as my key light for the rings and kind of an optional fill light for the other side when I need it. Both these lights have great color accuracy and RGB capability to change the mood of the shot or match the lighting of the wedding venue. They are also plenty bright for ring shots and macro shots where the light sources are really close, but more importantly, the brightness can be dialed in from the maximum all the way down to 1%. This is huge because the speed lights I bring to weddings are often too powerful for ring shots even when they're at their lowest power and I'm stopped down. It just doesn't usually work out. Tip number 5 is to adjust your exposure settings for maximum sharpness. Because I don't bring a tripod to weddings and because the XE3 doesn't have IBIS or in-body image stabilization, I actually set my shutter speed at a setting that avoids camera shake for handheld shots. So this is typically between 1/160 or 1/250 of a second or faster for using with the macro extension tube and the 56mm 1.2 or the 50mm 1.0. And when using a macro extension tube, the depth of field actually becomes razor thin. So for the aperture, I'm usually in between like f4.0 and 8.0, and I've actually noticed that most of my shots are shot at f5.6, so you can kind of use that as a starting point. And as far as the ISO is set, I set that for ambient lighting. Basically, if I'm shooting with candles or string lights in the background that I found in the venue, I adjust the ISO so that those are exposed well, and then I kind of dial back my lights to kind of match that kind of exposure. This is typically going to be around 800 to 1600 ISO. Okay, so one of the biggest tips that you need to know is you need to keep the rings on the same plane of focus. Because I don't use a tripod, that means I don't utilize the focus stacking feature on my Fujifilm camera. So the question is, how do I obtain focus for these macro shots? Well, the key is placing and posing the rings on the same plane of focus so that basically the edge of all the wedding bands are in the same plane as the gem or the stone of the engagement ring. From there, when you're focusing, I place the AF point on the engagement ring stone, and I'm really looking for kind of like crisp focus and detail in that specific area. And then I utilize the zoom in feature or the check focus feature of my mirrorless camera, my Fujifilm camera, when needed. Take a lot of safety shots because you don't want to think you got the shot, come back home, and then it's not usable at all. That's not good. Tip number 7 is to use multiple lights, so more than one light. Using multiple lights is a key to actually adding depth to a wedding ring photo or any product photo in general. I use at least a minimum of 2 lights, but this is usually kind of scaled up to 4 lights to kind of create that dimension. As far as the light distance to the subject, they're usually no more than kind of like arm's length apart, maybe no more than 2 to 3 foot of working space is what I'm using. And my main focus is to ensure that the lights are just kind of like not in the frame, but they're as close to the rings as possible. I like to use both of the PavoTubes, one on each side, to add a back rim light to the ring arrangement, and this also creates the highlight on whatever background texture is in the shot. So for these shots, I typically add a specific color to match the wedding theme or a warmer kind of temperature, usually 2700 Kelvin or 3300 Kelvin to match the candles and the tungsten lights of the wedding reception venue. And then I use the 1 to 2 Lido lights with diffusion as the key and fill for the ring. So So the key light is kind of off to the side 45 degrees to the engagement ring stone, and then sometimes I add another little light on the other side to carve out more shape on the other side of the ring. So when you're trying to capture kind of like the sparkle in the jewelry, you want to get on eye level with the rings and kind of move the lights a little bit, keeping an eye on the shape and the highlights created within the reflections within inside that diamond. Tip number 8 is to pose the rings and have a variety of poses at your disposal. So I use typically 3 different poses or arrangements as my go-to. The first is if the rings are relatively of the same size or easily balanced, I kind of just stack them on top of each other. The second kind of style is using the groom's ring in the center and kind of having the engagement ring and the wedding ring kind of hanging on each side of it, kind of like diagonally. The last is just laying all the rings kind of next to each other flat. This kind of gives the option to photograph the rings on eye level as well as top down so you can see the circles. Tip number 9 is to use your creativity to personalize the photo to the couple. So the funnest part of shooting the wedding rings is to kind of hunt for items around the venue to personalize the shot specific to the couple's personality, their interests, or even just the venue decor that you found. While a lot of wedding photographers take kind of like a lay flat approach, arranging the rings with the flowers and the shoes and the invitations, I like to create more of a dramatically lit image for my style of ring shot, so you won't be able to lay different types of objects next to it, but instead they're going to be kind of in the background, kind of out of focus and giving more of a kind of abstract look. In order to build up these shots, first I look for any textured or reflective surfaces in the venue that I can place the rings on. In a pinch, I also bring a pocket mirror in my camera bag that I can place the rings on for a quick kind of mirrored reflection shot if I really can't find anything else interesting in the venue. From there, I try to find random objects in the venue that are either textured, shiny, metallic, reflective, or illuminated, just something to place in the background of the rings that gives a highlight. And this kind of gives character and story to the bouquet of the rings that is unique to that specific venue. And bonus points if you can find something that really represents the couple. For example, in one wedding, the couple decided to give out their favorite snacks as party favors to guests, Flaming Hot Cheetos and Sour Patch Watermelon. So I made a quirky ring shot with the rings on top of the snacks. It's not really the most glamorous shot, but the couple absolutely loved it. Tip number 10 is to clean up the photos in Photoshop or some type of editing software. After the wedding is done and you've imported and edited the images, I almost always do a quick pass in Photoshop to clone out and heal and remove any dust that is either on the rings, on the background, or on the table that might distract the viewer and degrade the overall quality of the image. This process is not required, and you do have to learn how to use Photoshop or some type of photo manipulation software, but I do feel that it makes for a better image more often than not. So I'm hoping that this video gives you the confidence and inspiration to try creating your own dramatic wedding ring photos without the need for a dedicated macro lens. I have links to all the gear used down in the description below. If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments below. If you want to see more wedding photography videos like this one, hit the like button and let me know which photography tips you're interested in learning next. And if you haven't already seen my off-camera flash tutorial, I really encourage you to check it out up over here. As always, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, as I make a new Fujifilm or photography video every week. And if that's too long for you, please follow me on Instagram at ReggieBPhoto, as I'm sharing new tips, tricks, and tutorials every single day. Alright, that's it for me. Remember to get out, go shoot, and I'll catch you all in the next one.